So Amnesty International released a report this morning, and it found that Israel is an apartheid state. Now, I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of mixed feelings about Amnesty International. You know, sometimes they do good work, but at the same time, let's not kid ourselves. The stuff that they put out, especially when it comes to supporting Western intervention, you know, it coincides a lot of the times with what Western imperialism is trying to accomplish, right? Oh, look how bad this dictator is. We have to go in and, you know. But even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I do want to look at this, not because it's big news. I mean, we all know Israel is an apartheid system. We didn't need Amnesty International to spell that out for us. Speaking of which, here's a tweet by Nyla. She says, "Why are people celebrating warmongers amnesty for saying what's happening in Palestine is apartheid in 2022? A Palestinian child in Palestine could have told anyone that decades ago." Yeah, absolutely. But there are some good things in the report that I want to touch on because they're always worth talking about and worth mentioning. So I've tried to, again, it's about 280 pages. And I find it absolutely hilarious that the Israelis called it anti-Semitic before it even came out. So I'm wondering how they read it before it even came out. But anyway, I'll get to that in a second. Let's look at what they actually said in the report. Let me play you a couple of sections, and then I'll read to you from the report as well. Let's take a look.
Whites and blacks in South Africa, where a regime ruled by a racist white minority declared themselves officially superior to the black majority, then proceeded to dominate them. South Africa's apartheid system officially ended in the mid-1990s, but that doesn't mean apartheid can't happen elsewhere. Here, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, Palestinians are being forced off their land and out of their homes, separated and segregated by laws, walls, and checkpoints. They live in a constant state of fear and insecurity, and deliberately impoverished. While, on the other hand, Israeli authorities have given the Jewish Israeli population privilege over Palestinians in just about every facet of life. The definition of apartheid. The crime against humanity of apartheid is perpetrated when particular serious human rights violations are committed with the purpose of establishing and maintaining a system of domination by one racial group over another and systematically oppressing them.
Right, so they've given you the definition of apartheid and what it means. So I'm just going to read to you from the report. I've outlined some sections here, because they make a couple of points of why it's apartheid. Right? They give you the definition, why it's a crime against humanity, it's a violation of international law, and then they go into the details of it. And so the first thing that they talk about is how Israel is trying to take the land and make it exclusively Israeli Jewish, okay? And how do they do this? So, quote, "Since its establishment in 1948, Israel has pursued an explicit policy of establishing and maintaining a Jewish demographic hegemony and maximizing its control over land to benefit Jewish Israelis while minimizing the number of Palestinians and restricting their rights and obstructing their ability to challenge this dispossession," right? So, if you're Palestinian, your house gets taken from you, I mean, good luck. Good luck trying to get it back in an Israeli court. Today, all territories controlled by Israel continue to be administered with the purpose of benefiting Jewish Israelis to the detriment of Palestinians, while Palestinian refugees continue to be excluded. At the same time as establishing Israel as a Jewish state, the 1948 Declaration appealed to Jewish people around the world to immigrate to Israel. In 1950, Israel granted every Jew the right to immigrate to Israel under the law of return, followed by the right to automatic Israeli citizenship under the nationality law of 1952. So do you understand what that means? That means if you're an American Jew from Brooklyn and, you know, your parent, let's take Bernie Sanders as an example, right? He's from Brooklyn, he's Jewish, his parents are from Poland, I think, and I mean, he could technically go to Israel and claim citizenship even though his family has no connection to Palestine. They don't come from there. They're American/European. And he could go to Israel and have two citizenships. He could have the American one and the Israeli one. And the Palestinians don't even have one citizenship. They don't even have one nationality that they can travel with around the world, right? I mean, I'm going to get Roni, my cousin, on, again, the show to talk about this, because he's Palestinian. He doesn't have an actual passport, right? Every time he has to go somewhere, they look at his documents and they're like, what is this? So, they're effectively stateless. So you could be a Jew from anywhere, from Australia, from the UK, and you could just go there and claim citizenship just by virtue of being Jewish, not because you actually have any relationship to the land or to the place. And you get two citizenships, and Palestinians are screwed. They have zero. Very nice, right? Very fair. And that's, of course, the UN's fault also. It's not just, the Israelis. The UN is at the source of this. But just to continue, so the Israeli authorities saw this partly as a necessary measure to prevent another attempt to exterminate Jews in the wake of the Holocaust, and to provide shelter to Jews who face persecution elsewhere in the world. And I understand that. I get the idea, but pay attention to that, because what they're saying is Jews are safe in Palestine. Remember that. Remember that the next time that they say Arabs hate Jews. That's complete nonsense. If Arabs hate Jews, why are Jews going to live right in the middle with Arabs? How does that make any sense? Especially after the Holocaust. Remember that the next time that these Israeli politicians are saying, oh, Arabs hate Jews. Complete nonsense. You have Arab Jews. You've had Jews and Arabs and Muslims and Christians living together for centuries and centuries. The Holocaust didn't take place in the Middle East. Arabs didn't do that. So just remember that the next time they try to say that Arabs and Palestinians hate Jews. Complete nonsense. So I'm just going to continue here what they're saying. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees displaced during the 1947 to 1949 conflict remained barred from returning to their homes based on demographic considerations. The essence of the system of oppression and domination over Palestinians was clearly crystallized in the 2018 nation-state law, which enshrined the principle that the state of Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, and that the right of self-determination is exclusively to the Jewish people. So that was under Netanyahu, right? They passed this nation-state law where basically they're affirming that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, which, again, that's a clear contradiction of when they say Israel is a liberal democracy. How could you be a democracy and then you say that this country is only for a certain group of people? How is that democratic? They want to have their cake and eat it too, right? They want to market themselves as a democracy, but then Palestinians are not allowed to vote. They have no political rights. They have no rights whatsoever. They don't even have human rights, never mind political rights. So the point that they're trying to say here is that Palestinians were kicked out of their homes. They have no right to reclaim their homes, but someone who's Jewish, who's not even from this area, who's maybe European or Australian or whatever, can come and take not just citizenship, but also the land. So do you see what's going on here? Let me continue with the clip.
Before Israel was established in 1948, Palestinians comprised most of the population, around 70%, and owned the vast majority of private land, about 90%, in what was British Mandate Palestine. Jews, many of whom had emigrated from Europe, comprised around 30% of the population, and they and Jewish institutions owned about 6.5% of the land. In the course of establishing Israel as a Jewish state in 1948, Israeli authorities acted to turn the situation on its head and were responsible for the mass expulsion of Palestinians and the destruction of hundreds of villages, forcing around 800,000 Palestinians out of their homes and lands. Today there are around 6 million Palestinian refugees who Israel denies the right to return to their homes. After the 1967 war, Israel occupied the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Israel's brutal military rule, coupled with the establishment and expansion of illegal Jewish settlements, has coerced Palestinians into enclaves, creating further fragmentation and segregation. The objective? Maintain Jewish-Israeli hegemony and maximize control of land. In the city of Jerusalem, the Israeli official policy is to maintain at least a 60% Jewish majority.
Right, so you heard that they have a goal. Their goal is to make sure that 60% of the population in Jerusalem is, at least 60% is Jewish. And again, I don't need to remind you that Israel is illegally occupying Jerusalem. I mean, if we're being frank, they're illegally occupying all of Palestine, not just what some people at the UN decided is allowed to be Palestine. But even under the UN, even if you're going to go and because the Israelis they say that the UN gives them their legitimacy as a state, but they don't want to listen to the UN resolutions that say that they're illegally occupying Jerusalem, right? And yet they come in, they pass this Jerusalem law in 1980, they annex Jerusalem illegally, just like they illegally annexed the Golan Heights in Syria. And then they seek to increase the settlements, to drive the Palestinians out, and use military force against them. You know, they subject them to military rule. And again, just to read this passage for you. Since the 1967 annexation of East Jerusalem, which again is illegal, Israeli governments have set targets for the demographic ratio of Jews to Palestinians in Jerusalem as a whole, and have made it clear through public statements that the denial of economic and social rights to Palestinians in East Jerusalem is an intentional policy to coerce them into leaving the city. It's very important to understand that.
So where do all the Palestinians live now? 3.4 million live outside of Israel in the occupied territories, mainly in refugee camps in neighbouring countries. 2.5 million Palestinians live in Israel and East Jerusalem, restricted to enclaves that make up around 3% of the entire area. 3 million Palestinians live in the occupied West Bank, but are only allowed to access 40% of the land to live and work. The rest of the area is for the Jewish Israeli settlers only. 2 million are trapped in the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas in the world.
Right, so you heard the first thing that they said is that you have over 3 million Palestinians who are, you know, either in Jordan, in Syria, and in the neighboring countries who most likely fled after the Nakba, or during the Nakba, which is it means catastrophe in Arabic. It's the ethnic cleansing. That's what it means. It's the 1948 ethnic cleansing, when the Israelis started driving out Palestinians. And as they mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's about 800,000. But I mean, it's far greater than that. Again, you have millions who are in the neighboring countries. Let me read this passage to you. So here they say Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories living under these separate jurisdictions require permits from the Israeli authorities to cross between them from and to the Gaza Strip, annexed East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank, and are also separated from Palestinian citizens of Israel, both geographically and on the basis of their status. So you see how they were explaining to you how you have Palestinians in Gaza, you have Palestinians living in the West Bank, you have Palestinians outside Palestine, you have Palestinians who are Israeli Arabs, but these Palestinians are all separated from each other. So just if you're a Palestinian living in the West Bank, you can't go to Gaza and vice versa, right? So they make it difficult for you to even see your family, which we'll get to in a second. I just want to keep reading for you. So meanwhile, Palestinian refugees displaced during the 1947, 1949, and 67 conflicts continue to be physically isolated from those residing in Israel and the OPT, occupied Palestinian territories, through Israel's continuous denial of their right to return to their homes, towns, and villages. Palestinian citizens of Israel are subject to Israeli civil laws, which in general afford them greater freedoms and human rights protections than Palestinians living in the OPT, but nonetheless deny them equal rights with Jewish Israelis, including to political participation and institutionalized discrimination against them. So even if you're a citizen, you're not equal to a Jewish Israeli citizen. I mean, that by itself, very, very clearly apartheid, but it's not just that. While Palestinians in annexed East Jerusalem also live under Israeli civil laws, they are granted permanent residence rather than citizenship. Right? So the Israelis took East Jerusalem. If you're living there, they don't even give you They want to say that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but if you're a Palestinian who's living in annexed East Jerusalem, you're not allowed to be a citizen, apparently. So, again, more discrimination. On the other hand, Palestinians in the rest of the West Bank remain subject to Israel's military rule and draconian military orders adopted since 1967. The vast majority of these orders no longer apply to the Gaza Strip after Israel removed most aspects of its military rule there with the withdrawal of settlers in 2005. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip are additionally subject to Palestinian laws. Israel placed its Palestinian citizens under military rule for the first 18 years of its existence, from 48 to 66, and used during that time British mandate defense emergency regulations. Does that ring a bell? That granted them unrestricted powers to control the movement of Palestinian residents, confiscate their property, allow for the closure of entire villages as military zones, demolish their houses, and try them before military courts. Palestinians required permits to leave their areas of residence, including to access medical care and jobs. Israeli state institutions placed Palestinians under a system of surveillance and control that deliberately restricted their political freedoms by banning protests and arresting political activists on account of their political activities. So again, we talked about the defense emergency regulations, I think just last week. I was explaining to you how this is something that was enacted by the British during 1945 when Palestine was still a British mandate. And it's effectively martial law. It's basically something that they passed to quell the Arab revolt, to suppress Palestinians, and they can do whatever they want, and it's still in effect to this day. They still use administrative detention. For example, they can arrest you based on a secret file. You're not allowed to know what's in the secret file. Your lawyer is not allowed to know what's in the secret file. They can hold you for 6 months at a time, and they can renew it indefinitely. There's no charge. There's no trial. I mean, completely draconian, right?
Jewish Israelis have only one ID card, with a status that grants them the right to live almost anywhere they wish in the country. They can move freely with access to healthcare and vast resources. Palestinians, on the other hand, have 4 types of ID cards, if any at all. The kind of ID card you are given determines the level of rights you can enjoy and controls where you can go and what you can do. If you hold a green card, you are subject to military rule. And if you have a green card with a Gaza address, it means you're trapped in a 365 kilometre square open-air prison under Israeli military blockade in place since 2007. Israel controls what goes in and what goes out, from children's toys to medical supplies. 90% of the people have no access to safe drinking water, 47% are unemployed, 56% live in poverty. Palestinians with a Gaza ID are forbidden from going to Jerusalem in the West Bank, even if they have family there. Some people in the West Bank are considered to live there illegally and can be deported immediately to Gaza if found by the army, even if they have been in the West Bank for decades. Whereas, if you hold a green card which has a West Bank address, then you live here. This green card means you can live within specific enclaves surrounded by illegal Israeli settlements. And there's a separation wall and fences built around you since 2002, which Palestinians call the Apartheid Wall. It's 8 metres high in places and 700 kilometres long. That's twice the height of the Berlin Wall and more than 4 times its length. 80% of it is built inside the West Bank, occupying even more Palestinian land. There are separate roads for Israelis and Palestinians, hundreds of checkpoints scattered throughout, not to mention the 54 years of occupation which has devastated the lives of millions of Palestinians. Palestinians with a West Bank ID can travel to Gaza or East Jerusalem, but only if they receive a permit from the military to do so. This blue ID is for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. They can travel to the occupied West Bank as well as to Israel, but they are not citizens of Israel. They have only been granted a residency status. This means that they cannot vote in Israeli national elections, and if they leave East Jerusalem for too long, for example to study or work abroad or in other parts of the occupied West Bank, their residency is revoked, so they can't return. Since 1967, Israel has revoked the residency status of more than 14,600 Palestinians from East Jerusalem. Finally, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have been through it all. They are the group that remained in Israel despite the ethnic cleansing in 1948. They lived under Israeli military rule that applied only to them and not Jewish Israelis for 18 years, between 1948 and 1966. They were made citizens but can never become nationals and enjoy equality unless they become Jewish, which the law prohibits. They are the only Palestinians who can run and vote in Israeli elections, and they can move relatively freely, but the inequality against them was never dismantled, and they face daily institutional discrimination, including as members of parliament.
Right, so you heard, he said that those who are technically citizens and who are able to vote, this is what the Israelis will do. They'll ignore everything else that was said here and then focus on the last points that you see. That's not apartheid. You have Arab Israelis in the Knesset and the Israeli parliament. How could it be apartheid? Yeah, that's, again, this is lying by omission. So by leaving out all the other cases, as we just talked about, as you just saw in the video, there are 4 kinds of ID cards. If you are from East Jerusalem, you can go into the West Bank and into Israel. But if you're from the West Bank, you can go to Gaza only with a military permit. If you're in Gaza, you can't go anywhere. What the hell? I mean, you have to be a fool or a liar to say that this isn't apartheid. It's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. And it's really disgusting how you have people in the United States and Europe who are dying to defend this, who think that this is some kind of humane system. Shameful. Absolutely shameful. I want to read you a bit more from here, from the Amnesty report. They say, since 2002, Israel has adopted a policy of prohibiting Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza from gaining status in Israel or East Jerusalem through marriage, thus preventing family unification. By contrast, the 2003 law explicitly did not apply to residents of Jewish settlements in the West Bank wanting to marry and live with their spouse inside Israel, making it, and the ongoing policy underpinning it, blatantly discriminatory. So you understand that? If you're, for example, you're Palestinian who's, in Gaza, and you marry a Palestinian from the West Bank and you want to move to the West Bank, you can't do that. It's not allowed. But if you're a Jewish Israeli, you can go anywhere you like. Interesting, right? Very interesting.
And if this complex ID system wasn't enough to segregate the Palestinian community, in 2002, Israel introduced a law that prohibits family unification. That's right, denying Palestinians the right to live with their loved ones if their ID cards are different. And this woman is one of thousands of Palestinians who Israel will not issue any ID card. She can't travel, can't hug her family, only see them meters away across the border.
That's heartbreaking. Did you see that? They're not allowed. They're not allowed to see each other. This family, they can't hug each other. Look, they're just
the right to live with.
They're just meters apart, and because they have different ID cards issued to them by the Israelis, they're not allowed to see each other. I mean, that's just disgusting. That's like, it's like they're treating them like animals or something. Again, not that you should treat animals like that, but, for the sake of the phrase, what is that? What is that? Like, this is an artificial border that's been put here by colonizers. Why shouldn't they be able to hug? What is this? Are they criminals? What is that? Even if they were criminals, it's like, what is this whole thing? Like, you have to, place people in like Sam's conditions, like no hugging, no family visit. What is this? This is draconian. This is evil. This is evil. So I just want to read you the conclusion. From Amnesty's report. The totality of the regime of laws, policies, and practices described by Amnesty International demonstrates that Israel has established and maintained an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination of the Palestinian population for the benefit of Jewish Israelis, a system of apartheid, wherever it has exercised control over Palestinians' lives since 1948. Amnesty concludes that the State of Israel considers and treats Palestinians as an inferior, non-Jewish racial group. The segregation is conducted in a systematic and highly institutionalized manner through laws, policies, and practices, all of which are intended to prevent Palestinians from claiming and enjoying equal rights to Jewish Israelis within the territory of Israel and the OPT, and thus are intended to oppress and dominate the Palestinian people. This has been complemented by a legal regime that controls, by negating, the rights of Palestinian refugees residing outside Israel and the OPT to return to their homes. Without taking any meaningful action to hold Israel to account for its systematic and widespread violations and crimes under international law against the Palestinian population, the international community has contributed to undermining the international legal order and has emboldened Israel to continue perpetrating its crimes with impunity. It's true. In fact, some states have actively supported Israel's violations by supplying it with arms, equipment, and other tools to perpetrate crimes under international law, and by providing diplomatic cover, including at the UN Security Council, to shield it from accountability. They're talking about the United States and the UK. By doing so, they have completely failed the Palestinian people and have only exacerbated Palestinians' lived experiences as people with lesser rights and inferior status to Jewish Israelis. Amnesty International is therefore calling on the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to consider the applicability of the crime against humanity of apartheid within its current formal investigation. Because as you remember, the ICC has opened, it ruled that it has jurisdiction over the Palestinian territories and therefore can investigate war crimes committed by the Israelis against the Palestinians in the 2018 Right to Return marches and several wars on Gaza. And actually investigate Hamas, right? The Israelis, they claim that it's an anti-Semitic investigation and it's only targeting Israel. It's not. It's an investigation into Hamas, into the PA and Israel. It's both-sided. It's not partial. But they won't tell you that, of course. In any case, Amnesty is referring to that investigation. And they say, while the ICC has held that it has jurisdiction over Rome Statute crimes committed in the OPT, it does not have jurisdiction over crimes committed within Israel itself. The UN Security Council must therefore ensure that perpetrators of the crime against humanity of apartheid and other crimes under international law in Israel and the OPT are brought to justice, either by referring the entire situation to the ICC or by establishing an international tribunal to try alleged perpetrators. The UN Security Council must also impose targeted sanctions, such as asset freezes, against Israeli officials most implicated in the crime of apartheid and a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel. So they mean sanctions, essentially. All governments and regional actors, particularly those that enjoy close diplomatic relations with Israel, such as the USA, the European Union, and its member states, and the United Kingdom, but also those states that are in the process of strengthening their ties, such as some Arab and African states, right? Israel is trying to court the African Union and join it again as an observer. And of course, we talked about the Abraham Accords, where Bahrain and the UAE have now normalized ties with Israel. So they're referring to that. They must not support the system of apartheid or render aid or assistance to maintaining such a regime and cooperate to bring an end to this unlawful situation. Amnesty International is also reiterating its long-standing call on states to immediately suspend the direct and indirect supply, sale, or transfer of all weapons, munitions, and other military and security equipment, including the provision of training and other military and security assistance. Finally, it is calling on states to institute and enforce a ban on products from Israeli settlements. So that's the essence of BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. So, again, did we need Amnesty International to tell us this? No. Is it good that they did it? Yes. But I don't think it goes far enough. I think it's too little too late. And, you know, the word colonialism doesn't really appear in the report, except when they're citing sources. But the problem with this report and the way that they've said a lot of right things, correct things, but the way that they've packaged it, the way that they've talked about it is as if like they're not talking about the issue of settler colonialism. Yes, there is an apartheid system. Why is there an apartheid system? Who is creating this apartheid system? It's settlers, it's colonizers. And they even start delving into it, right? They're saying that anyone who's Jewish can just come to Israel and claim nationality and claim citizenship. Yeah, this is the system of settler colonialism. And it didn't start with these 50 and 52 laws. It started, of course, before that. But the whole essence, the whole issue here is settler colonialism. You have people from Europe, from who the hell knows where, whether they're coming to occupied Palestine now, or their parents did, or their grandparents did. These people are from Europe. Again, Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister now, he's American. He's from the United States. Netanyahu, I know at least one half of his family, I think it's his mother's side, is Polish. So you have people who've come from Eastern Europe, people who've come from Europe, people who've come from the United States, from all over the world, who are coming to Palestine and treating the Palestinians, who are the indigenous, who are the natives, as crap. Let me explain this very simply to you. If you go to Palestine and you ask an Israeli where their grandparents come from, or their great-grandparents come from, they're going to tell you, likely, Europe. Go ask a Palestinian where their grandparents come from, or their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-parents come from. They're going to tell you Palestine. They're going to tell you the Middle East. They're not going to tell you Ukraine. They're not going to tell you the United States. They're not going to tell you Germany. Do you understand? There are people who are still alive today who have the keys to their homes that were stolen from them in 1948. So this is not a past issue. It's not, we can't fix this. It's too old. No. This is happening now. Those people are still alive now. Do you understand? And again, that's the difference. Go ask a Palestinian where their great-great-great-great-great-grandparents come from. They're going to tell you Palestine. That's the difference between an Israeli and a Palestinian.